Badlands. Explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
Greetings, everybody, to this week's episode of Breaking History. Gordon will be joining us in about 20 or 30 minutes. He's running a little bit late, but that's okay, because until then, we've got some very big shoes that he's going to have to fill as our special guest, who I'm going to introduce in a second. Now, we just passed an ominous, but yet very auspicious date. Not auspicious, that's not the word. Ominous is the better word. Date, an anniversary on November 4th of 1995. This was a 30-year anniversary. There was the assassination of a figure named Yitzhak Rabin, who I think everybody here in this audience of this live stream has become familiar with. If you didn't know him before, the al-Aqsa flood operation as a rather major false flag coordinated event 2 years ago, you certainly discovered who he was after by watching this show. There was a major shift, a major potential that had emerged in the early 90s with the emergence of the earliest years of the Clinton campaign and the figure of a certain renowned Israeli warrior, a Zionist, who had done, I would say, a lot of damage in the course of his career, but who had a big shift of mind, a shift of paradigm, and agreed to establish a new set of rules premised around a different way of thinking and feeling about what it means to be a human. So I'm talking about, of course, again, Yitzhak Rabin was murdered by certain agencies that didn't want this potential world of peace in the Middle East to occur. So now that we're in the 30th anniversary, we thought it was a very important time to revisit this question, and who better than my good friend Martin Sieff, who is a gentleman who I think many people I know watching right now already know of Martin Sieff's work, but if you don't, you're going to really find this, I think, a pleasure. Marty, I met him originally when I was a writer with Cynthia on a Russian news platform called Strategic Culture, which we no longer write for. Marty doesn't either, due to sanctions and geopolitical reasons, but otherwise we got to meet his mind and began working with him, and found that he's got a poetic brilliance when it comes to analyzing history with a look to the future, which I really appreciate, as everyone knows. So Marty's been a 20-year correspondent for the Washington Times. He's traveled the world. He's hobnobbed with top brass and political players, the likes of which we can only imagine. And he's offered to grace us here with a little discussion about Yitzhak Rabin and the importance of what happened, what almost happened, and what did happen 30 years ago, and the importance for today's world. So let me introduce everybody to Martin Sieff. Marty, how you doing?
So far, so good, Matt. Always a pleasure to be on with you.
Yeah, likewise, man. I was just going through a little bit of our how I came to meet you, and of course, I didn't mention that you're also on the advisory board for our Rising Tide Foundation, which we appreciate immensely. The classes that you give for the Rising Tide Foundation are always an immense pleasure, and I encourage everybody here, if they have not yet signed up, do so now to get access to Marty's classes from the past and also going forward. But Marty, you wrote to me just a few days ago describing your insights into Yitzhak Rabin and the importance of bringing this to light. And let me ask you this. Why is it important today for people to appreciate who this person was who was murdered, and what's that all about? Like, why is this important to you?
He was a complex man. He was a well-meaning man, which is of crucial importance. He was sick and tired of war, and he spoke about this in his last years, especially in the months before he died, about his determination to literally give peace a chance. I'll hopefully go into that a bit more later. He even said this to audiences like the APEC annual conference in Washington, where he faced a hostile audience, and he knew he faced a hostile audience, but he was determined on this, and it went back all the way with him. As a young Israeli soldier, still in his teens, and already a senior officer in the pre-Israel state Palmach prototype paramilitary forces, he had fought in the bitter convoy battles to feed Jewish Jerusalem during the 1947-48 War of Independence. And he literally said, I heard him, I reported on this in the Washington Times at the time, he said, I can still hear the death screams of my friends, boys and girls alike, when they were being killed in armored cars around us. We've got to stop this happening. For God's sake, give peace a chance. He literally felt this way passionately. He felt this way passionately. But the key point here is everyone knows about the peace process and all its limitations and flaws in the Oslo peace process. And Yasser Arafat was not an admirable figure in that, to put it mildly. Not at all. We can get into that later. And terrorism against Israelis soared exponentially after the peace process was signed and as territories were turned over to the Palestinians, and as Arafat, playing a double game, encouraged terrorism against Israel at the same time he was pushing the peace process simultaneously. And I was in a pole position to cover this because I was State Department correspondent at the Washington Times. We had a relatively small, very good foreign coverage section and reporters at the time. But because it was relatively small, as is true in many such papers like the Irish Times, you had to cover different areas, either sequentially or at the same time. So because I had knocked around the Middle East so much and had been at the paper for quite a number of years by that point, they gave me the peace process beat. And so I was in pole position to cover Rabin, which I did, and to cover the increasing hostility to Rabin personally, as well as to the peace process in Israel. But it wasn't hostility to the peace process that killed Rabin. And this was not my original reporting. The research is out there. It's available. A man who is still alive, Itamar Rabinovich, eminent Israeli academic, close personal friend for decades of Rabin and his top advisor, has testified to this. Rabin, and from my own background observing Rabin and his work over previous years, I was in a position to verify this. Rabin had also been secretly working on a much more important peace process even than the Palestinians, which would have avoided the catastrophe and civil war we've seen in Syria to this day. He had already privately concluded a peace deal with President Hafez Assad of Syria, and in which Syria would agree to recognize Israel, to end all hostilities and state of war with Israel, not to cooperate. The two countries were too hostile to each other for that, but they didn't need to. They were going to coexist. What was the price for this? Rabin had agreed to return to Syria the Golan Heights, which Israel had occupied and since then settled since the 1967 war. Now, as the French found in Algeria and as the British found in Rhodesia, what's the problem in the long term of colonizing or settling any country? Your own settlers don't refuse to let you give it up, and they usually have a disproportionate influence with the nationalist wing or the right wing in their own countries. And this blocked peace in Algeria for more than a decade, with fearful results. The Algerian War of Independence was one of the most savage in modern history, even by modern standards, ferociously horrific. And this was part of the same problem here. But there was a deeper problem, and that is divisions in the Israeli deep state. Many of these came out afterwards. First of all, I know UMAT and Cynthia are both experts on the work of Colonel Fletcher Pruitt, who was one of the great whistleblowers about the Kennedy assassination and the operations and how they operate of the US deep state and other deep states too. And one of Colonel Pruitt's central points, of course, is if a defense establishment wants an assassination to happen, they want a leader to be removed, whether it's Olof Palme in Sweden or President Kennedy or even President Lumumba in Congo back more than 64 years ago, no, 62 years ago. No, 64, sorry. But if they want that to happen, you don't have to do it. All you have to do is remove the security screen. There'll be plenty of nutcases there that you can keep your eye on and you can quietly encourage, and they'll do the dirty work for you. And this is what happened in the case of the Rabin assassination. Now, before we go any further, there are a number of cliches of both left and right that I became convinced were equally wrong in the Rabin assassination. The Likud party in Israel did not want it to happen directly. They hated Rabin. And if you look at the nationalist rallies that Mr. Netanyahu, still Prime Minister of Israel today, and already a very ambitious leader of the Likud party back then, they had coffins with Rabin's name on it at his rallies, and he pretended not to see them. He denied seeing them afterwards. But the video evidence is irrefutable. He knew they were there. It's an open call for assassination. But the assassination was not in Netanyahu's interests or the Likud interests. And I, again, was given access to this as a reporter, as a fly on the wall. I mean, the world, as you and I both know, are full of people who claim to have been insiders and were only in their own assassination, in their own imaginations. They knew sweet nothing and still don't. But they'd like you to imagine the whole, as they imagine, the whole universe revolves around them. I was a working reporter. I didn't count. I mean, I really didn't count. None of us did. But we were there. And if you're there and you're a fly on the wall, you see what you see. And during the build, right after the assassination, the Washington Times flew me to Israel to cover the aftermath to it and the background to it. One of the people I interviewed is dead now, David Bar-Ilan, who was a very ultra-right-wing figure, editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post newspaper at the time. And when I was very young, I'd even worked for a while at the Jerusalem Post when it was a much more moderate, centrist, pro-peace paper under a totally different ownership and direction under the late Ari Rath, a wonderful man who died just a few years ago at the age of 96 in Vienna. Mr. Netanyahu's Israel Ari was disgusted by. And although he'd been a pioneer Zionist and a Holocaust survivor and a Holocaust orphan, and had a most eminent career in Israel, he left Israel to go back and live happily in Vienna, Austria, in his retirement for the last 25 to 30 years of his life, which is an extraordinary story in itself. But this is a different Jerusalem Post. Mr. Bar-Ilan was the managing editor. And because I was from the Washington Times, I had access to him. They loved the paper. The paper was very pro-Israel. And he gave me an interview. And it was fascinating. And you must remember, this man was also Mr. Netanyahu's probably most trusted foreign policy confidant and advisor at the time. And we got onto the subject of the assassin, young Yigael Amir, an ultra-Orthodox, all too pious student at the ultra-Orthodox University in Israel, Bar-Ilan University, and who had been in the middle of a small cell of people who had later turned out was known to Israeli security, the Shin Bet. And they had their own operatives who had penetrated the cell and monitored it and knew the talk of assassination and even planning of assassination was going on and did nothing to stop it. Shin Bet knew the assassination plan was going ahead. They did nothing to stop it. Now,
I mean, this sounds kind of like the same MO that we've seen from COINTELPRO, FBI infiltration of different cells of either anarchist terrorists of the 60s or even the later FBI infiltration of different terrorist cells, like the thing that did 9/11, not 9/11, sorry, the World Trade Center bombing in 1993, where you had Ahmed Salam, who is like an Egyptian FBI informant, assigned to manage the entire cell, provide the bombs, provide all of the intel that he was giving back day to day in reports to his FBI handlers, who not only did nothing, but it seems like they actually were directing it. So, I mean, do you get the sense that Israeli intelligence was using a similar MO, possibly even not just being impotent, but maybe, just saying maybe, even directing the thing?
Yes, but it was not the right-wingers. It was not the usual suspects. It was the left-wingers. Shimon Peres was Minister of Defense at the time, and he and Rabin had been arch enemies in politics and personally for more than 40 years. They wanted the peace process with Arafat to succeed, but they were utterly implacably opposed to returning the Golan Heights to Syria. This is the crucial distinction that nobody makes and that has to be stressed and is central to the importance of everything. And the second one is Peres's central role in Israeli politics and in Israeli intelligence dirty tricks for 50 years. And
so are you saying that you think that Shimon Peres might be more complicit than the Netanyahu circles in the murder of?
Without question. Without question. Yes. There is another factor. The opinion polls, which I continually looked at and checked out myself, and what Bar-Ilan had to say to me about it, even on deep background. Bar-Ilan is dead now, I think, at least 20 years. So, and you know, he was a very honorable fellow to me personally. He gave me very valuable sources on this story. He made me look good. And when I checked them out on these issues, at least he was a straight shooter. An unfortunate phrase, perhaps, in this context. But, you know, he spoke directly. And Bar-Ilan privately, he didn't want this known publicly, would have embarrassed him at the time. And I honored it. Hated the assassin, hated Amir. He told me he would have Amir should have been shot, and he would have happily strangled him with his bare hands. And Amir was a miserable little creep, no doubt still is. You know, again, a Samson in his own imagination. I guess a little sardine. And Bar-Ilan was a big, impressive man, and he could have done it. But why did he feel this way? He was very explicit. We were winning the election. We were going to win a landslide. We were going to give Likud and Mr. Netanyahu the biggest majority to do whatever they wanted. We wanted in the election, because public opinion had turned against the peace process so much because of the onslaught of attacks. We had won the election, and then Rabin is shot, and our lead vanishes, and all of a sudden Peres is the candidate, is the new prime minister, and he has a 20 to 25% lead in the polls, whereas we had a 30% lead in the polls. And it's all because of that evil little bastard, that stupid little prick.
Well,
that's what he said to me, and it made sense then, and it makes sense now.
Okay, well, let me ask you. So let me ask you this just as a quick one. So, what is it specifically in your mind that Yitzhak Rabin? What did he want to do, such that the Golan Heights was being threatened to be given back to Syria? What was his broader vision? What made him such a threat? Before I ask some follow-up questions.
It was that the Israeli military establishment was actually in favor of a controlled peace process with the Palestinians, because they were like the KGB, who I covered this in the Soviet Union up to the collapse of communism. The biggest force supporting Mikhail Gorbachev for reform and liberalization was the secret police. Why? Very simply, because they were the only people who had the big picture. They had all the secret information on what was really happening in their own country, and they knew the old Stalinist, post-Stalinist, Brezhnev, Khrushchev policies were not working, were collapsing, and therefore the Soviet Union had to reform or die. Now, of course, they tried to reform and the system died anyway. That's maybe a story for another time. But it was the same principle here in Israel. Shin Bet and Israeli intelligence actually supported a qualified peace process with the Palestinians and Mr. Arafat. They were in favor of it. The man who was most in favor of it was Shimon Peres. And Rabin was against it, not because he opposed peace in principle. He deeply wanted peace, but he loathed and distrusted Arafat. So did someone else, the president of Syria, Hafez Assad, because Arafat had spent the previous 20 years making deals with Syria, agreements with Syria, and then breaking every one of them. And Assad was convinced that Arafat was slime, and he didn't trust him 1 inch. But he did trust, incredibly enough, Yitzhak Rabin, and even more incredibly, Yitzhak Rabin trusted him. If you look at relations between Israel and Syria from after the 1973 war, through the negotiations for the 1975 disengagement agreement, they are totally peaceful for 22 years. The only conflict is when the Israelis go up against Syrian tank forces in 1982, when Menachem Begin, who is a hot-headed jerk and who is obsessed with Lebanon, takes on Syria too, and the Israelis get a minor bloody nose. They have a nasty surprise. They find the Syrian army, as they had found in 1973, is tough and disciplined and brave, and the Syrians didn't have air power. Israel did, backed by the US. So Israel won that confrontation quite easily. But whenever the ground forces clashed in 1982, the Syrians held their own. And therefore, Begin had to back down. But from 1983 onwards, in coalition governments, Rabin was Minister of Defense. And Rabin, not a single Israeli or Syrian soldier on either side died in action in the 12 years from 1983 to 1995 because Yitzhak Rabin and Hafez Assad basically trusted each other. So this was not Rabin gambling on somebody who he either personally loathed or distrusted, which had always been the case with Arafat. Nor was it Rabin suddenly having a vision on the road to Damascus. Of course, if you're living in Jerusalem, the road to Damascus is very close, right? And he's dealing with Damascus. No, he felt this way already. He was basing, Rabin, you must remember, was not a mystic. He was not a visionary. He was a quiet, apparently plodding guy. And he had not his dark side. It wasn't dark, but he had his very limited human side. First of all, any girl Israeli soldier, when he was a general in the army, if he said, come to bed with me, or I feel like a bit of action this afternoon, he got it. Well, that was true for all Israeli generals, but it was especially true in Rabin's case. He was famous for it, right? That's on the personal side. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't a paragon. He wasn't that bright. He wasn't the strategic genius he was made out to be. He was rather like General Marshall in World War II in the US Army. Like General Marshall, a figure of personal incorruptibility, not a great deal of brain power on top. Very disappointing as a military field commander, as General Marshall also was. Patton and Bradley and MacArthur, of course, all came to despise, and Montgomery in Britain, but the top American commanders too came to despise Eisenhower. But Eisenhower, at a strategic level and politically, was, of course, brilliant. And Rabin wasn't that brilliant, but he had common sense and he had determination. He went ahead. He had one other weakness, and it was a big one. And he had the weaknesses as often falsely ascribed to President Ulysses Grant in the Civil War. Grant went on wild drinking sprees that knocked him out for a week at a time, but never when he was in action, and never when he was in battle, and never when he was a commander. Rabin was much worse. Rabin only went to pieces with booze when he was under pressure. Before the 6-Day War, he was totally incapacitated for the week before the war because he couldn't take the pressure, and he retired into the bottle. And this
that's interesting, because I was listening to some memorials of Yitzhak Rabin from like the BBC and other things this week, and one thing that they keep on asserting is that he was the strategic, brilliant designer behind the 6-Day War, as if he was like personally responsible for this maneuver that expanded or justified the expansion of Israel's territories, fourfold, or I don't know how much, but a significant amount of territory. But you're saying something different. You're saying that he was a mess during that entire time.
He was totally drunk and out of the situation. And the prime minister at the time, Levi Eshkol, was a rather corrupt, in a very small scale way compared with later people, but still personally very soft and corrupt, and panic-stricken figure who went to pieces at two. So there was a catastrophe in Israel. They had the military power, but they really felt they were faced with not just with existential destruction, but with a leadership that couldn't do the job and was criminally incompetent. Personally, I think that's the same dilemma they face today. Under Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Smotrich and Mr. Ben-Gvir. The worst problem they have is the weakness at the top. But that was definitely the case in 1967. So why did they win so well? Because two men, both in the military, filled that gap. And the two men were General Moshe Dayan, who was the FDR, or the Winston Churchill of Israel already. He was the great hero who made the Israeli army a formidable fighting force in the 1950s, and then won with vastly inferior forces, a far weaker Israeli army. He knocked the stuffing out of the Egyptian army in 1956. And critics of Israel and haters of Dayan say, oh, it was really because the British and the French were on their side. That was Egyptian President Nasser's alibi at the time. No, it wasn't. The British and French move to seize the canal was ponderous and inept. And by the time they went there, the Israelis had done the dirty work for them. But Dayan was responsible. This was recognized in Israel. And the other man, incredibly enough, was Dayan's own brother-in-law. They had married sisters. General Ezer Weizmann, who had been for many years commander of the Israel Air Force, and then went even higher as chief of military operations. Okay. Now, Weizmann despised Rabin all his life for being a coward and falling apart in these situations, which he had done. And a few years later, it happened again. Henry Kissinger put together Israel's peace deals with Egypt and Syria. And he forced the Israelis to give up a lot of their gains at the end of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Now, again, anti-Semites and anti-Israel conspiracists and anti-Zionists in general tend to look on it's like anti-communists looking on the Soviet Union. Gorbachev will be as bad as Stalin. Everyone, they're all the same. It makes no difference. No, it's not true. They may be on the same side. They may be on. You may love them, or you may have good reason to loathe them. But there are key policy and personal differences between them. The Israeli government, including even the Labour Party governments of the time, and certainly the neocons in America, hated Kissinger at the time. In Israel, and I was there starting out in my career as a young freelancer, knocking around, looking for freelance work and getting a little, enough to keep my self-respect going, but pretty much not enough for anything else. It was all there. The hostility to Kissinger, even the cartoons in the Jerusalem Post, and accusing Kissinger of all people, who was of a Jewish background, of being an anti-Semite. It was they hated Kissinger like poison. But the man who most feared Kissinger was Yitzhak Rabin. Kissinger drove him back into the bottle. Now, of course, Kissinger spent the next 50 years of more of his life until he died at an incredible age of 100, just a year or two ago, refurbishing or working to refurbish his reputation, that he was, lovable and good-natured and charming and witty, and he could be all these things. But if you worked for him at the time, as we have the testimony of dozens of people, if not hundreds, at the State Department or the National Security Agency, he was hell on wheels. He demanded the best, he rewarded the best, but also he crushed you. I mean, he demanded people work impossible hours. He screamed abuse whenever he felt like it, with faux Germanic, unrepressed glee and forcefulness at the time. But most of all, in his diplomacy, he screamed and he lied and he threatened and he bullied, and it worked. It kept the wider peace of the world. It did work, but Rabin couldn't take it. And again, he retreated into the bottle as prime minister in 1974 and 1975. So he was a very flawed figure. He was. But he was sincere about peace with Hafez Assad. And he and Assad, I think, in some respect, were very similar people. And that is not in the one was a convinced Zionist, the other was a convinced Ba'athist, Arab nationalist socialist. Neither of them ever compromised their core values or visions or beliefs, which were incompatible. But they learned to be able to coexist together, and they came to respect, I think, to the surprise of both of them, as individuals. And I got independent verification, a second line of this, from my longtime boss and friend and mentor, Arno de Borgraaf, who brought me on board the Washington Times as editor-in-chief, and who I worked for then, and who later brought me in to run national security policies and eventually foreign coverage at United Press International. And Arno literally did know everybody. And among the people he knew well were Hafez Assad's brother, was the feared head of the Syrian secret police at the time, who verified to Arno the horrendous death toll at Hama. Hama in 1982, when 37,000 civilian innocent Syrian people were slaughtered, not by Israeli military power, but by Syrian military power at the time. And it was regarded at the time as, this was even after the Israeli bombardment of Beirut in 1975, I think, during this Lebanese civil war, but it was regarded for a generation as the quintessential war crime against humanity of any Middle East government, whether Arab or Israeli or anyone. It was people talked about in the Middle East, you fight by Hama rules, which means forget the Geneva Convention, no mercy to civilians at all. And it was Hafez Assad's regime that did that against Islamist fundamentalists, which has bearing on today too, which we might come back to if time permits, because it's very relevant to what's happened since. But he was ready to deal with Rabin. Rabin was ready to deal with him. Both of them distrusted Arafat. Rabin was determined to continue with the peace process with the Palestinians. He was not going to give it up. And I know this because I heard him say this with my own ears repeatedly, publicly. I was sent by the Washington Times in 1995, a few months before Rabin was murdered, to cover the annual AIPAC policy conference, which is really the assembled policy making of the pro-Israel, Israel-supporting Jewish community, and also from the wider world. They have immense support to this day, of course, from the fundamentalist Christian community across America as well. And the Christian view, the fundamentalist Protestant view, I think is an outrageous one, because they talk about what loving friends they are in Israel, how strong Israel must be. But if you look at what they really believe and what they want, they believe their version of the Messiah can only come in an apocalyptic war between Israel and they also believe, as you know, Matt, and I know you and Cynthia have done major work in exposing this too, and it still needs to be exposed today. In that war, according to them, virtually all Jews and Israelis will be exterminated. Yes. And it doesn't matter, because the ones who survive will become good Southern Baptists or good fundamentalist crackpots for some ludicrous outfit out there in West Texas or Pasadena, California, where they tend to hang out.
Well, and this sort of gets at the question of eschatology as well, like the eschatological belief structures of these various religious groups that have a very big political charge. A lot of like social engineering went into crafting a lot of the mythologizing about, the new age. So, there's different variations on the theme, as you pointed out. There's like, what this represents is one subsect within Protestant Christianity, but you have similar eschatological sort of stories that were infused into the Catholic, the Orthodox world, the Jewish world, the Muslim world. The 12th Imam is going to reemerge at the end times, to fight this great battle. So you got like different variations and sub-variations. So it's interesting how a bit of a Pygmalion effect that could be geopolitically beneficial to certain agencies that would like to control the world like a video game or a board game. They enjoy having these types of things, because at the same time, one of the things amongst the hard right-wing Zionist groupings that have really emerged in collaboration with their sort of Christian Zionist collaborators is that they also believe that this end times is going to happen, and that they don't like the Christians. The Christians don't really like the Jews, but they all feel this affinity towards each other because they believe that this end times thing is something that they have to usher in to bring in some weird idea of being instruments for God's will, right? To build the third temple, to inaugurate some blood and soil cult that will enshrine the new temple of civilization in this new age after. But it always involves a conflagration of some form of mass kill. That's the weird thing for me, is like, why can't they have eschatology without the mass kill? Like, just let's have a race to see who could bring in a new age where everybody's working together and thinking like as dignified human beings with respect. Why can't they have something like that God wants us to do? Why does it always have to be variations of massive bloodletting and purgative violence that'll be like some holy crusade or holy bloodbath? Before you answer that, I'm going to do a quick commercial, and then we're going to jump in to continue that one. So here we go. All right, make self-care great again with All Good by Jessica Storm. This holiday season, treat your hair to All Good's bestseller, the Tallow Hair Mask. Deep hydration, zero junk, just simple organic ingredients with purpose. While you're shopping, grab the new drops. Tallow Beard Balm tames the whiskers without the grease. Tamed Hair Serum, fizz-free, shine in one drop. Whipped tallow, light, fluffy, and available in 3 subtle scents you'll love. All handcrafted in small batches from Clearwater, Florida, and delivered to you in glass jars so that it's all good inside and out. No toxins, no parabens, no sulfates, no BPAs, no PFAs, and no BS. Head over to badlandsmedia.tv/allgood and use promo code Badlands to snag your discount and support Badlands Media. That's badlandsmedia.tv/allgood, promo code Badlands. All right. Now we got one more thing from Badlands shop that I'm going to have to read here quickly, which is, I think it's SD Tallow. So let me just quickly. It is not SD Tallow. It is something totally other. So I'm going to not have that yet. We'll do that later on. So yeah, what do you think of that, Marty? I mean, this observation that I have of this weird obsession with eschatology and purgative bloodbaths from all sides. Why?
As I've said to you in our conversations so often over the years, Matt, you depress me enormously because I agree 100% with what you said. You've summed it up perfectly, and it's terrifying and it's frightening. And I am not an expert on this, but if you look at it, it's impossible to avoid. It's there. It's completely there. It's there in Washington. It's there in Jerusalem. It's in a lot of other places too. The Russians no doubt have their versions as well about the evils of the West and people ready to press the button. But there's one key individual, and I'd love for you to have him on Breaking News. And he knows more about this and is more outspoken about it than anyone else. And he's an Israeli figure of the highest integrity and eminence, a legendary career. His father was one of the signers of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. He was a heroic paratrooper in the Israeli army, decorated for bravery. He became head of the Jewish agency. I think he may even be an ordained rabbi as well. He was not just a member of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, he was the speaker of the Israeli parliament. His name is Avraham spelled with a V rather than a B, Avraham Berg, B-U-R-G. And he is an expert on this, and you'll find even on YouTube, he has outspoken warnings where he speaks about this. He's not allowed to speak about it, even as a former head of the Knesset in Israel, but he's spoken to conferences in Britain, in Germany, I think in the United States. And he would be an older man now. He would be certainly in his 70s, possibly his 80s. And I don't know if he'd be willing to come on board with Breaking News. He's a very mainstream, traditionally liberal, dignified fellow, but he's also totally honest and totally fearless. And he understands this dynamic better than anyone else. And he makes the point just within the context of Judaism, but it also applies, of course, within Islam and within Christianity exactly the same way. Normative Christianity, normative Islam, normative Judaism are not like this. Otherwise, the world would have been cinders generations and millennia ago. They have all accommodated to coexistence one way and another through history. If you look at the coexistence and the cynical relationship, but it worked between the Kingdom of France from the time of Francis I, from 1500 onwards, heavily influenced incidentally by Leonardo da Vinci and the humanist values of the Renaissance. They made a strategic alliance with the most powerful nation in the Western world, which was the Ottoman Turkish Empire, to keep the Catholic Church and the Habsburg empires of Central Europe, Austria-Hungary, and of Spain, which had conquered the Americas, to keep them in control and balance them. And it was France, not England, that was the crucial factor in keeping these empires in check. And they could only do so with a relationship that lasted for hundreds of years with the Muslim Ottoman Empire. The English later played the same role. They built up and protected and preserved the Ottoman Empire for 150 years against Russia, until oil was discovered in huge quantities in what is today northern Iraq, around Mosul, ancient Syria. And then under Winston Churchill at the beginning of the 20th century, the British do one of their typical cynical, dramatic U-turns. And from being committed to preserving the Ottoman Empire, they're committed to dismantling it so they can seize control of the oil of Iraq for themselves, which they do. So, but the key point here is, and this back to Dr. Berg, Abraham Berg, and that is, he said, after the messianic catastrophes 2,000 years ago, when the Jews followed Menahem of Golan and got the Second Temple destroyed, and then they followed Bar Kokhba and were lunatic enough to take on the entire Roman Empire. And to this day, fanatical Jewish nationalists will tell you Bar Kokhba should have won. If you want to make an enemy of an ultra-Jewish nationalist, tell them Bar Kokhba was a bloody lunatic who never had a chance of defeating the Roman Empire.
I almost got punched in the face. I didn't realize that this was such a hot topic, but I was a political organizer many years ago, and I was just talking to people back in, I think, 2013 or 2014, and there were a group of very seemingly gentle, reasonable Jews that I just was chatting with, like 3 or 4 of them, and they all seemed like very, I had a disdain for their general opinions about the world, but they were very pleasant. They liked debating and Platonic dialogue, so I was having an enjoyable time. And then I took a jab at the Bar Kokhba rebellion as a completely disastrous operation run by a fanatic, and one of them like literally turned beet red and was getting very violent, grabbing me by the shoulder, and was very close to swinging a punch. And I didn't know what I was touching on, but now I came to realize, this guy has been elevated to the status of some sort of a god or a demigod in the mind of a lot of these weird right-wing romantics.
Exactly. And as Dr. Berg points out, this is not normative Judaism. The Orthodox Jewish rabbis buried Bar Kokhba for 1,800 years. He became a non-person. They were embarrassed by him. And not just embarrassed, they were terrified by him. They were appalled by him. It took 50 years after 60 years after Bar Kokhba died, before a genuinely great and wise Jewish leader, who was actually the man who put together the Mishnah, the great Jewish legal code, which shapes Orthodox Jewish identity and thinking and practice and morality to this day, Rabbi Judah, who is known as Rabbi Judah, I think the son of Gamliel II, and he's known as Rabbi, or the third, but he's known as Rabbi Judah the Prince. He's a very eminent figure to this day in Jewish history. And what does Rabbi Judah do? He does the opposite of Bar Kokhba. He makes peace with Rome. He becomes a personal friend of the famous philosopher emperor Marcus Aurelius. They exchange books with each other. Marcus Aurelius sends him his famous Meditations, and he sends Marcus Aurelius the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible, which is a very thoughtful and skeptical book, and incidentally a deliberately anti-messianic book in the heart of the Hebrew Bible. Because, and for the 1,800 years until modern times, and even modern Zionism does not admire Bar Kokhba. They regard him as a loser too. The early Zionists were not religious men. They were not eschatologists. David Ben-Gurion and his socialist Zionist generation looked at were proud of being socialists and Marxists. And for them, Marxists meant not slaughtering millions of people, but applying rational sociological and scientific principles to the problems of powerlessness and anti-Semitism and racism and persecution. And this was the basis on which they tried to build their own Zionism. And there were lots of blank hypocrisies to it. There were lots of blank openings to it. That's something we can debate with and even agree on with other people on other occasions. But they did not believe, and neither did Dayan or Rabin or anyone like that, or anyone in mainstream Israel into the 21st century, about this kind of lunacy you are talking about. It was always a small minority operating underground. Look, I covered Menahem Begin for many years. And I enraged him with my reporting so much in the Middle East, even when I was in my 20s and freelancing away, that I was banned from the Prime Minister's office in Israel. They thought that would destroy my career, but of course I'm Irish, and I was due to go back to Ireland anyway. And it was back in Ireland that I made my career, and nobody there gave a shit what Menachem Begin thought about me when I came back to Ireland. In fact, later on, when I told the story afterwards, I had friends like Doyle McManus, the admirable veteran, legendary bureau chief of the LA Times in Washington. And Doyle, bless him, I could always call a free drink out of him when I told him the story or reminded him of it, because he loathed Begin too. He had contempt for Begin. And Begin was literally mad. He wasn't an eschatologist, but he was quite literally insane, which is another story for another, or maybe for later today, I don't know. But in terms of this, what you're talking about, it was under the surface. But now, for the first time, Mr. Netanyahu, who I think wrongly, was ruthless and right-wing and had his vision, but I never saw himself as an eschatological lunatic. But first of all, he's associated with them and empowered them now. The two most powerful people in the Israeli government since 2022 are Mr. I always forget the first name of Mr.
Ben-Gvir?
And Ben-Gvir, and Mr. Ben-Gvir, of course. And they're perfectly open about it. They make no secret about it. Yeah. They and their hundreds of thousands of followers are eschatological lunatics. Yeah. They really believe that they have a blank check, to do whatever they want, and God will wipe out all their opponents for them.
Yeah, well, just to remind people here, what these guys have in their mind when they think about like God's will for Israel, this is what they think of. It's a very different Israel from what we're used to seeing on a map, but this is the greater Israel that Theodor Herzl had outlined as well in his dialogues and writings to a variety of people, including Rhodes.
That's an anti-Semitic myth and well laid out. Herzl was the opposite. Herzl did not believe in such a vast state. And he wrote about it. There's a book about him. He has his vision for Israel. And it's tiny. It's nothing like that at all. It's a peaceful Israel. And in a way, it's a fairy tale.
I don't know, man. He was writing to Cecil Rhodes saying that I'm inspired by what you've done in Rhodesia and want to emulate your model. Like there's articles where he's actually quoted from.
That's because he's licking ass with the British. And he wants the British to do his dirty work for him and set up a Jewish national state. And Rhodes, as you well know, was a very dark figure and one of the most powerful men in the world at the time. And he may even have evolved in his views in darker directions. But it's not what he was. What he was is he wrote a novel. And it's an excruciatingly bad written novel. It's embarrassing to read. But someone said once, and it was George Orwell said it, of course. If you look at all the best things, George Orwell said them all first. And George Orwell said, if you want people will lie about themselves in their autobiographies. That's sobering to me because I'm trying to write a relatively at least, or even a genuinely truthful autobiography about at the moment. But the one thing I want to keep out is embarrassments to friends and colleagues about many of their embarrassments, not to mention my own. But that's personal. But I'm trying to make it politically and historically truthful, and it's never easy if you're even allowed to do it. Herzl, but Orwell continues, were our people true to themselves? Or maybe it was Malcolm Muggeridge who said it. They're true to themselves in their fiction, in their fantasies. If you read anyone's fiction, you see the central character is going to be them. Winston Churchill wrote one very bad but very revealing novel about a liberal romantic revolutionary who basically blows open the Dardanelles Straits to Constantinople and becomes a revered figure in the history of his nation. And he wrote it in his 20s, and it's called Savrola, Savrola. Herzl did that. In 1896-97, he wrote a novel which he had been a playwright, and a successful one, heaven help us, in the Austrian Empire in Vienna. But he thought this was his great artistic masterpiece. And the way to get Herzl mad was not to defend Bar Kokhba to him. He didn't know who Bar Kokhba was. He was ignorant of all things Jewish. It was to say that his book was a joke and not the masterpiece he thought it was. But it was a joke, and it's revealing to that reason. It's called Alt-Neuland, Old New Land. It's so influential, it became the name of the biggest city in Israel, in Hebrew, Tel Aviv. Okay. Tel is an ancient mound, Aviv, spring, the spring ancient city. And they got the name from Herzl himself. And what is his vision of Israel? His vision of Israel is a peaceful land where the Jews come in. They don't have to do any dirty killing or what have you. The Arabs welcome them rationally because they bring wealth and prosperity for the Arabs as well as themselves into the land. Everything's happy. It's a classic liberal cover story, except Herzl genuinely believed it. But there is a villain, a dark villain. Is the dark villain a Muslim leader preaching extermination of the Jews? No. Is it a Catholic Spanish leader or English Protestant leader who's a Bible fundamentalist who wants the Jews to be killed in a conflagration of war? No. It is a rabbi. It is a rabbi who wants Israel to be a Jewish state rather than that. And the language Herzl chooses for Israel at this point is not Hebrew or even Yiddish. It's German, because he regards German culture as the supreme culture in the world. He reveres German culture. He comes from it in Austria. And the last thing Herzl does before he dies, very young, at the age of 44, and there are stories that ultra-Orthodox rabbis put a death curse on him, which I do not rule out. I mean, when these people, there was a death curse put on Mr. Rabin before he died. And by a handful of rabbis who were ultra-Orthodox rabbis who were outcasts in their own community, but they were old and they were into black magic, into the Kabbalah and what have you. And there's no question they carried out the ceremony. But of course, it's easy to make a prophecy of death come true if you then project a couple of individuals with guns to actually make sure the prophecy does come true. That's
absolutely. Yeah, it's the Pygmalion effect again.
Exactly.
But you don't think that Herzl was probably more of like a useful idiot, like who wasn't a bad guy, but who was disposable ultimately? Because I mean, I quoted from him in my book where in his diary entries and in his letters, he even said when discussing what he was demanding with his German counterparts is, here are the demands that we'll make: an area from the Brook of Egypt to the Euphrates. And he goes in depth into the amount of immigration and territorial expansion that they would need to have peacefully. Of course, that's how they're selling it. But I mean, it seems like he had this idea of a very much bigger Israel than what we currently see.
When you put it that way, I agree with you. But the idea of an Israel of military, you must remember Herzl was a white imperialist and colonialist. He took it for granted. This is why he revered Cecil Rhodes so much. Who were the two individuals that Herzl looked up to as the great geniuses and visionaries, the towering titans who will be remembered forever for their wisdom and strength and courage and civilization? Cecil Rhodes and Kaiser Wilhelm II. There is one another note in his diary when he has just been disciplined. He's gone to the Rothschilds for money for this vision, and the Rothschilds have turned him down because they regard him as a bad investment. He's a crackpot. And of course, he is a crackpot, right? So what is Herzl's reaction in his diary? Licking his wounds. He's humiliated. He thought James de Rothschild and Britain and the rest of the Rothschild clan would pour untold billions of dollars. So then again, they could do basically what America has failed to do in the last 50, 60, 80 years, bribe everybody inside to make the world we want, and everybody will be totally happy. He would have approved of the American solution, bribe everyone in sight. But of course, it doesn't work, or it doesn't work for long, or the people ready to take your bribes are people so loathsome, like Andrew Cuomo in New York, that nobody with a free choice will vote for them or fight for them. That's the great flaw of this kind of corruption.
So what shifted? Because by the time William Rothschild was working with Lord Balfour a few years later, he was pouring cash into the whole.
Herzl was dead. And Herzl is a romantic who has no idea of how governments really work. No idea. And actually, Chaim Weizmann doesn't either. But Chaim Weizmann has become the leader of the Zionist movement in Britain, which is not important when World War I breaks out. But Weizmann is something else. He is not a world-class chemist, but he is a world-class chemist. He's not a genius. He cannot do what Richard Waldstatter did, we knew very well, and discover the process of chlorophyll, the way by which leaves absorb energy from the sun and turn them into organic material and growth. Another great German Jewish chemist, Richard Waldstatter, did that. It's the basis of basically all ecology, all modern biology. It's the basis of everything. And it's a benign discovery, always benign. But there was also Fritz Haber, the man who fed the world, the man without whom 5 to 6 billion human beings today would have starved to death, because the world had run out of nitrate fertilizer, which only people thought came from basically guano, bird droppings in the 2,000-mile length of Chile, and you couldn't get significant quantities otherwise. In China, of course, they relied on human droppings of excretia, and it's called night soil, and it's still used to a limited degree there today. But who saved us from this nightmarish world?
Yeah, Haber. Yeah, he was
exactly, and Karl Bosch, right?
Yes,
and
sure.
They were close personal colleagues and even friends of Chaim Weizmann.
Okay.
Weizmann learned from them to be an organic chemist. So while Haber and Bosch, especially Haber, was happily creating, using the same nitrate processes to create unlimited explosives for the German war effort in World War I, Chaim Weizmann was doing the same thing for the British Admiralty and Winston Churchill and the British Royal Navy and the British Army in World War I at the same time on the other side of the fence. This put him in strong and made him useful to the British establishment. But Jewish romantic Zionists confuse cause and effect. The story which you see, which is taught to millions of children in the American Jewish community and beyond, is that Britain loved Chaim Weizmann so much that they ordered the Balfour Declaration as a reward for him for supplying them with ammunition in World War I. The opposite is the truth, which you and I have discussed before. And you will recall, you actually have what's the word? At Rising Tide Foundation, you already have this seminar I gave to Rising Tide up on this. Chaim Weizmann was a useful idiot for the British Empire. Herzl was too, but he died before he could be more useful. The British actually planned to use Herzl to colonize Africa. Their solution, and I think you're very familiar with it, was the
Angola plan. Oh, Uganda. Okay.
Uganda, exactly. No, exactly Uganda, the Uganda war plan. And it would have worked. At the time, the British imperial government was totally in favor of it. There was only nobody who actually lived in Uganda, none of the native peoples there were in a position or allowed to be in a position to object to it. There was only one opposition, the Zionist movement themselves. They had read their Bible, and even when they were secular nationalists. And for them, their Ireland, their Poland, their Serbia, their sacred homeland, wherever it was, had to be in Palestine, nowhere else. And at the last Zionist Congress that Herzl ever attended, Weizmann led the Palestine nationalist opposition to Herzl. And they defeated Herzl. They defeated the founder of the movement, and they derailed the Uganda program.
Can I ask you a question about?
Yes, of course.
Oh,
if I may.
Yeah, I just want to ask you a question about, like, 'cause all of us. It seems like we're talking about things that are several degrees separated from a causal nexus, because these are all sort of disposable, pawns on a chessboard. But when I'm looking at this sort of thing, and the question of, the emergence of the greater Israel agenda, the idea of eschatology as synthetic ideologies infused into religions to get political effects. When I look at these things, one of the things that gets me, I find closer to a causal nexus involves, like the Charles Warren Quatuor Coronati Lodge run by King, or then Prince, Edward Albert, who became Prince Edward VII later on. Which was setting up the Palestinian Exploration Fund in the 1860s and was like working to map out Solomon's Temple back in those days, that had this whole idea of bringing about some end times cataclysm in order to, which involved the Jews going back by some way into that region to fulfill a prophecy. So that's the sort of thing I'm looking at. Did these Freemasonic outfits run by royal family members and their attendants, did that come up so far in your research, or not so much when you look at these things?
Not so much at all. And they're there. There's no question they're there. But they are actually crackpot ideas. We had the same thing in Ireland. There's a movement, you can probably still find lots of them today. I think they're much stronger in America. They're non-existent in Britain now. But 120 years ago, they were big in Britain, the British Israelites. The idea that Britain and Western Europe, but especially Britain and the British Empire, are the lost tribes of Israel.
Right.
And coming from Northern Ireland, I was influenced by this very strongly, to my great embarrassment for most of my life. But as a teenager, I swallowed, and later on at least passively listened to.
Oh, there's a lot. Even today, it's a very robust movement. I encountered many British Israelites who write to me because they're very offended by what I say. But it seems like they take great pride in the fact that, like, even the King of England had his coronation on top of what is it, Jacob's stone from the story of Jacob's ladder.
Which it isn't. It may not even be the original stone which was stolen in 1951.
Oh, it's fake. It's clearly fake. Yeah.
Yes, exactly, Matt. Exactly.
But they seem to take this stuff really seriously, where you've got this weird idea of this magical stone that Jacob slept on when he went to heaven up the ladder, and you got like water from the Euphrates or from the Jordan River sparkled on his head, and you've got all of these weird.
Yes, King Charles may be surprised to hear it. Maybe he won't be. But I think he would be surprised that he is going to be the Messiah. Not just, a forerunner of the Messiah, but the Messiah. Because back in the 1950s, when he was born and a little boy, that's what these delightful clowns were preaching. And if you go back earlier to 1910 and 1936, I don't have it anymore, unfortunately. I should have kept it. But there is a book by a fellow called Davidson, I think, Davidson, which was published in 1935 and 1936 and was very widely influential at the time. And this is 20 years after World War I, when people should have known better. And he claims to use the exact measurements of the Great Pyramid to show that Jesus will return to Earth in 1936, and he will put the Prince of Wales, King Edward VIII, as he became, a very creepy and shifty little shit who liked being wheeled in a pram by his wife as an adult. He had very interesting and entertaining fetishes, right? And Winston Churchill shipped him 3,000 miles away to the Bahamas through World War II because he was regarded as too much of a Nazi sympathizer and too much of a repulsive, even little crackpot, even to have close at home. But he was going to sit on the throne of David in Jerusalem, according to the measurements of the made of the Great Pyramid of Egypt. And people will believe this stuff.
It is. There's a crazy factor, a kooky factor, but it's the fact that it's associated with corridors of power that can make top-down policy. Gives me goosebumps that could take your eye out. And let me just show you something else that gave me goosebumps when I first saw this a couple of years ago. I was like, no, sure. It's true. Here, let me just show you this. All right, this is how. And I'm sure that Prince William and Kate don't make these decisions themselves, but this is Drobes chose to present their baby for the first time to the public, their second child.
Sure.
Here, check this out. This is what they chose to have Kate wear when she presented her baby boy to the world for the first time a few years back. Is a direct replica of the Roman Polanski movie Rosemary's Baby, when what's-her-face, the woman who's seated with with the Antichrist, is presented with red roses, with a exact. I mean, that could be said to be a coincidence, but it's quite the coincidence if it is. That's a big stretch. Now, either that's a sick joke, or there's some crazy ideas floating around in certain corridors of power. Which, for me, when I see people like Tony Blair, who I just noticed he's not only on the Board of Peace. Weirdly named Technocratic Board of Peace, which is supposed to like usher in some new security apparatus to manage the disarmed Hamas Gaza for a number of years in this new sort of retrofit. This guy is actually a Knight of the Order of the Garter, which is one of the most high-end chivalric orders in the 14th century that only a few. Emperor Hirohito was made a member. but very few.
And look how he turned out. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and he's the guy who's been assigned to defend Catholicism. Like this clearly satanic little atheistic bastard has been assigned the task of being put into positions of public debates with either atheists as his opponents or whatever. Like, and of course he always loses. He always loses. So Christianity, when people listen to him trying to defend Christianity for the lamest reasons, they become increasingly more convinced that there's no such thing as that Christianity is garbage. But this is the guy who, as you know, was assigned somehow to represent the Catholic Church, and he's got this idea. It seems like this is floating around. I'm noticing in certain corridors of restoring the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Even Steve Bannon just gave an interview last week where he said, "How about a 3-state solution, which involves, Jews, Christians, and now Jews, Muslims, and Christians having their own states," which I think Bannon being tied to these Jesuit operations and these Catholic Habsburg operations too, might have an idea also of their own eschatology of getting back to that thing that we saw 1,000 years ago at the heart of the Crusades of like a Kingdom of Jerusalem, which might involve some other thing. So these are just, I don't know, what do you think about any of this stuff?
It ought to be ludicrous. It ought to be insane. But of course, you can't rule it out. Exactly. I mean, look, I had never seen that photograph those two pictures that you just showed. Wow. Now, on the one hand, I've got to quote Groucho Marx. He comes to mind on this. I am a Marxist, not a Karl Marxist. I'm a Groucho Marxist, and proud of it. Right? And what did Groucho say in one of the classic Marx Brothers movies? And this, when he's pulling off an outrageous scam, who do you believe, me or your own eyes? Of course, don't believe your own eyes. Believe me every time. Buy the Brooklyn Bridge. It's a great deal, and I'll throw in the Golden Gate for you as well. And there's a couple of nice structures they've built in Abu Dhabi and Shanghai. You can have them cut price too. All it takes is $100,000 in cash in used notes. That's all I'm asking from you. Isn't that a great deal? Well, what do we see here? There are 100,000, maybe a million, 10 million, 100 million people who read The Guardian, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The LA Times, watch and listen to the BBC every week, and will look at those two photographs you gave of Rosemary's Baby and the Princess, future Queen of England, and say, "Oh, you believe your own eyes? How stupid of you." So you good folks who are watching Breaking News and Badlands out there, who are obviously already, you've taken the other kind of pill, either red or blue. I can never remember in the Matrix which is which, but the good pill, the pill that wakes you up to a disturbing reality, right? You've taken the right pill, right? And what do you believe? Do you believe 100 million brainwashed idiots? Or do you believe your own eyes?
Yeah.
I'm at my age, at 3/4 of a century, I'm still learning to believe my own eyes. And believe me, it's not easy. It's not easy.
Yeah, I know. But it's weird, this conflict between like what we believe and what we experience. And sometimes, I remember having a fight with somebody. This is actually something that happened to me because I once upon a time, long ago, I believed in global warming. And I remember having a fight with somebody who did not believe in global warming. This is maybe 2003. And I didn't know any better, but I was really, really holding my ground, trying to hold my grounds because I had seen Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth. And, I was fed basic propaganda that I didn't know how to think about. And it was January and we're outside smoking in January in Canada. And it was freezing. And yes. I remember at a certain point defending global warming, man-made global warming so fervently. And then I had to laugh a little bit because it was like one of the coldest winters ever. And my hands were shaking. I don't smoke anymore, but my hands were shaking. I could barely hold my cigarette. I was like, what am I doing? And I realized what a fool I was, that my own senses of freezing to death was like being overridden by my indoctrination. So it's like that for every single thing. But definitely putting on the crazy lens, and like when I say the crazy lens, I mean just appreciating that a certain factor of crazy thinking animates a certain type of sophistication, brilliance, and power all throughout history. And being able to do that, you could start seeing things that would normally be something you would normally ignore completely as, who cares? Like, Jimmy Savile, partying for so many years with Prince Philip and Charles. You got, like, who's Jimmy Savile? Like, this guy was knighted by the Queen.
Yes,
and, like
the pedophile,
rapid and necrophile, and so much more. Like, overseeing, tied to things that are bringing in the highest echelons of banking and members of parliament into weird child, trap or whatever molestation networks in England and beyond, with little boys' schools or whatever orphanages. And it's like, this is some serious stuff. And these are the people being marketed in our tabloids and in press as being somehow, like, somebody in the chats just brought up how they were just watching a video featuring King Charles praying with the Pope and being celebrated as this pious defender of the faiths, all faiths, right? That's his new name, defender of all faiths. Not defender of the faith, but that's how he rebranded himself. So this is how they're being marketed. It's jarring. It is absolutely jarring to sort of look at that and think, like, well, how did people like Yitzhak Rabin, present an idea which was so troubling, so bothersome to these figures that they had to eliminate? Like, what is the quality of thinking that sends fear into the hearts of very, very bad players? And because that's the thing I'm almost thinking, like, how do we do more of that? Because we need to do things, even though there's a risk to one's health and life in many cases. The fact that they're trying to bring in a way of thinking that will help humanity break free of an otherwise disastrous set of rules that are gonna like, sink us all. That's really important, because, like, the Middle East needs it, the world needs it, right? I don't know. Let's round it out today. Like, what we're going into today's world with a lot of potential for good or for bad. Where do you see things right now? Russia's pulling out a little bit of the Middle East. I know that their new strategic doctrine is not to really get enmeshed too deeply into affairs within the Arab world as much. Like, they're trying to create sort of a containment, but not as much of an intervention as they had since 2015, when Russia intervened to block the overthrow of Assad. That seems to now be a new phase, a new security paradigm is being introduced there. We got Barak in Lebanon talking about disarming Hezbollah. He's trying to get Lebanon to sign on to the Abraham Accords. We got potential development of big economic projects, which could do a lot of good, but at the same time, I don't know if the stability is there. Is Israel going to, like, are they just biding time to go for a new phase of attack on Iran? Like, so what's your view of the current situation right now?
The same as yours, which is, I don't know. I hope. I had an auntie in Belfast. She never had any education, but she was a very loving and good person, and she had high natural intelligence. And she would always say, when something major was breaking in the world, Marty, we hope for the we hope for the best, but we prepare for the worst. And that I can think of no better wisdom or advice than for those of us who are looking on than that right now. The Soviets, Freudian slip on my part, the Russians were beaten completely in Syria. The cure was worse than the disease. You now have a former top man. I think he may have been the leader of al-Qaeda in Syria, certainly one of their top people. And he now openly appears at civilized, quote unquote, press conferences in America, chatting amiably with the former head of the CIA, General, I think he was, but certainly General Petraeus, who commanded US forces in Iraq back 15 or so 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And this is a surrealistic world. This is the world of George Orwell. This is not the world of 1984, even. It is the world of Animal Farm, where the pigs and the human and the farmers, the human exploiters, have become so interchangeable that they become like each other. The pigs act exactly the way the worst of humans do, and the humans have become the worst of pigs. and there is nothing to choose between. And that is Orwell's closing nightmarish vision at the end of Animal Farm. And it's too much for most of the adapters. Most of the adaptations of Animal Farm have a happy ending where the animals rise up against the pigs and reestablish a pure revolution. Of course, if they did, no doubt the same dark forces and dynamics would be unleashed, or inherited human nature might happen again. But Orwell's vision is too honest and uncompromising for even his sympathetic adapters to accept. So we don't know in the Middle East. There are three major sources of unpredictable instability in the Middle East, and they can all blow up today or tomorrow. Well, four. The first, obviously, is that since Hamas hates Israel like poison, and Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben Gvir, and at least the militaristic half of Israel, who are usually the ones who do not do the fighting and the dying, they hate each other like poison, and they're all looking for an excuse to renew the war. And only President Trump's personal, genuine, I think it's often naive, but his commitment to peace is the only thing stopping that happening. The president alone is the only thing stopping that happening. That's the first one. But that could blow up at any time. Secondly, the people running Israel are so unstable and mad and unpredictable for the reasons you have documented and given, Matt, and that Mr. Berg, the former Speaker of the Knesset himself, and a former Israel veteran combat soldier, has also given, that they could press uncontrollable buttons and set off wild escalations for a greater Israel in Syria, or a greater Israel in Jordan, or a war with Iran at any time. Thirdly, if the Iranians are hit, they will hit back. And if they are not hit, they might strike first anyway. Remember, Iran is a full member, and nobody ever remembers this, ever says it. Here, I don't think the conditioning even has to come from Prince Charles or any Rothschild or Citicorp or anybody else. All these idiots condition themselves. There is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, which is the most powerful and most populous military alliance in the history of the human race, which concludes Russia with all its unmatched thermonuclear capabilities, China, with its largest potential army in the world, which is modernizing its strategic forces to be on a par with Russia and superior to the United States, and is probably already superior to the United States, not that that is hard anymore. And India, who nobody ever mentions, which never had an alliance with the United States, just as a friendship, in order to get American high tech under their terms, knowing the Americans are dumb, which they are. The American leaders are very dumb. Right? And but the Indian government has had treaty relationships with Russia since 1955, and in the last few, since 1922, 23, it has been a full member of the SCO, which means an attack. It's like NATO. An attack on one will be an attack on all. So if the Israelis or the US goes after Iran, and Putin is not in control of his emotions, or Putin is in control of his emotions, but other people supplant him, or the Chinese decide to go ahead and back Iran anyway, and Iran is a major strategic ally and a major oil source for China.
Yeah.
This could blow up at any time. So yes. I hope that I'm glad the killing stopped. I always wanted that. And at least President Trump, bless him, has tried to stop the killing and has at least stopped it for now on a large scale. Biden and his vile creatures did not raise a fingernail to stop the killing in Gaza. Not a fingernail did they raise.
Yep.
Not a fingernail. And I have friends who actually are not friends of mine anymore. I now break up with them. I'm not remotely as tolerant and liberal and open-minded as I have been for most of my 3/4 of a century. I'm old enough now. I can't have long left. So I'm not prepared to be patient to put up with fucking shit anymore.
Fair enough. All right, I got a couple of ending questions for you, but before I do that, I'm going to have just 2 ads to run here. So I found the one that I was missing earlier. It's the Badlands shop. So here we go, Badlands shop. Okay, when your favorite Badlands show wraps up without a raid, visit the Badlands website to explore our incredible sponsors. From products featured on the show to kickstarting your shopping list, to the Badlands shop has you covered. Each purchase you make is a powerful vote for the future you believe in. We make it easy to shop America first, supporting Badlands creators and patriot small businesses that champion freedom. You're not just buying a product, you're fueling a movement with every dollar spent. Thank you for supporting businesses that support Badlands Media. Head over to badlandsmedia.tv and click shop for the menu and go directly to badlandsmedia.tv/shop. So that's the first one. The second one, here we are. Wait, I read that way too fast. All right, I have to learn how to pace myself a little bit because that thing's still going on. So everyone should just have that burnt into their eyeballs right now as you stare at badlandsmedia.tv/shop. Okay, next thing is the ad for SD Tallow. Here we are.
Before skincare went synthetic, people used something simple, something real, tallow. Grass-fed and finished beef tallow is packed with vitamins A, D, E, and K. Nutrients your skin actually knows what to do with. It locks in moisture, restores elasticity, and defends against winter dryness. No water, no preservatives, and no BS. Unlike plant oils or chemical creams, tallow mimics your skin's own structure. Elbows, hands, knees, post-shave, anywhere your skin's crying for real moisture. Perfect for gifting or keeping your own skin soft when the cold hits. Visit softdisclosure.com and use promo code Badlands for 15% off. Ancient care, modern truth.
Soft disclosure.
All right, for the last one, I just realized that there was I just looked at my messaging and I have one last ad, and this is actually to do with the Great American Restoration Tour that's happening this week. I won't be able to make it this year, but that being said, it's going to be available for streaming online, and I don't know if there's still tickets where people can get them to go physically in Florida, but that being said, here is the promo.
Here on the sun-kissed shores of Cocoa Beach, where the ocean meets the horizon, the Great American Restoration Tour continues on November 6th through the 9th, 2025. Badlands Media gathers patriots like you, not just to talk, but to rebuild. From truth-telling panels to unbreakable bonds, we're restoring the soul of our nation, one conversation at a time. This is the heart of the Space Coast, where the rockets defy gravity and dreams touch the stars. Feel the thunder of innovation that powers America forward. Together, we're not just healing the past, we're blasting off into a brighter tomorrow, a future where truth prevails, families thrive, and America leads once more. Join us in Cocoa Beach. Get your seat or your virtual stream pass now at badlandsmedia.tv/events. Launch is imminent, and you don't want to miss this liftoff.
Okay. All right. So, Marty, I had a couple of questions that I noticed from the audience. One person was asking something that I would be curious to get your thoughts on as well. So we had mentioned earlier on the 6-Day War in 19. So what is? There's a lot of articles, essays, books that have been written about something that occurred that not many people tend to address, which is the attack on the SS Liberty. Which resulted in, I don't know how many, I think it was over 100 American soldiers dying. There was a U.S. sort of signals boat just off the coast. What's your take on the destruction, the attack on the SS Liberty by Israel, and like why did that happen? Do you have any analysis on like who was behind that and the agenda behind that?
There are, of course, endless interpretations and this, that, and the other, but I have very clear views. And I did none of this original research myself. There are books out there, documentation stuff. Of course, the Israelis did it. They knew they were doing it. They had to know because the people on the Liberty put out huge American flags to show who they were, and the attacks continued. And the indication is that Rabin personally signed off on this, and so did Dayan. It was approved at the highest command levels of Israel. But why do it? Because they were desperate in America for survival, and they remained so afterwards. And the best argument I have seen is that within the CIA especially, and also in the State Department. They were, and still in those days, overwhelmingly sympathetic to the Arab side. And they were leaking information in real time. And again, Syria is at the heart of this, yet again, because at the time the attack took place, Israel had smashed the existential threat to its survival from Egypt. And they had also smashed the Jordanians when the Jordanians, believing Gamal Abdel Nasser's lies, came charging in on the other side. But they were. It's very clear, and there's never been any secret about this, that Dayan especially was the Syrians had been shelling Israeli civilians and Israeli settlements within Israel for decades, and they'd killed some lives, and they wanted to kill a lot more. And children, for example, had to sleep like wartime children in Britain and Germany did in air raid shelters. Repeatedly for years on a time when they lived in settlements close to the border. So now that they'd smashed Egypt and they'd smashed Jordan, and the Soviets were keeping out because they hadn't expected such a fast Israeli move, they were determined to smash Syria too. But the Liberty was an intelligence gathering ship. It was electronic intelligence. They would be able to monitor when the attack on Syria was going in. And once they reported it back to Langley and to the Pentagon, sympathetic word would go out to the Syrians immediately. And that would cost a lot of Israeli lives, or lead Syria to get the Russians and the Soviets and the UN Security Council to stop the Israelis before they took over Golan as well. And there's a book called The Secret War Against the Jews, which probably has a lot of paranoid stuff in it, but as you and I discussed before, sometimes you have to believe paranoid stuff, because everyone sneers at everyone for doing that. But look at the history of the world. The assassination that set off World War I and the catastrophe of Europe was done by one individual, Gavril Princip. Yeah. But he had a network behind him that went all the way up to the Serbian Minister of War. Serbia before World War I was a terrorist state, and it was the terrorist state that pressed the buttons for the assassination. And this happens repeatedly through history, as you and I both know. The Lincoln assassination is still passed off as, oh, it's just John Wilkes Booth. But not only did he have a strong support cell and group behind him, but there is ultimately the British government of Lord Palmerston was behind all of them. But there is very strong evidence that the two great gods of the conspiracy, President Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, especially Lee, knew the assassination attempt was coming and were devastated when it failed. Now, since Robert E. Lee has been successfully marketed to the gullible mainstream American people for 160 years as a great white shining knight on horseback, this colossal, any African American, of course, knows better. White Americans should know better too. So this same pattern applies here. When you look at the most plausible political context, when you look, why would the Israelis be so stupid as to run such an incredible risk? I must tell you, in my 40 years in and around Washington, I met many senior U.S. Navy officers who were in the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean at the time. Is it the 6th Fleet or the 5th Fleet? I always get them mixed up. I think it's the 6th
Hey, your microphone's sort of dislodged a little bit. It's all of a sudden.
Yes, it's better now. The 6th, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean. The 5th Fleet is usually further way out in the east. But the U.S. Navy in the Mediterranean, and including officers who had served as junior officers on the Liberty itself. And every one of them is convinced that the attack was deliberate and that it was very clear. And there was no, the Israelis certainly knew, and the Americans knew, and the Americans would have given the Israelis the intel, because they were very careful about such things, that no Soviet ship would have, communication ship was in the area. The Egyptians did not have one. The British did not have one there. Their navy was already tiny at that point. They relied on the Americans. There was no one else it could have been but the Americans. And of course, like you, on the Bar Kokhba revolt, I've not actually been beaten to a pulp yet. It can still happen. Life is young, but so far I have not yet been beaten to a pulp for actually daring to say that I believe the Israelis were culpable, and this was the reason why. But it may still happen. I hope it won't. But that's my assessment on that one.
And right now, okay, let me jump a little bit more to the present. I'd only alluded to it very, very quickly, but the Abraham Accords right now are animating Tom Barak quite a bit in his negotiations with Lebanese authorities to try to get Lebanon to get rid of their Hezbollah leadership, to disarm Hezbollah, and to ultimately orient towards recognizing Israel. They've had more success amongst many of the Sunni countries. What do you think? Do you think that there's any problems with the current design of the Abraham Accords, or do you think that it's workable and viable in how you're seeing it so far?
I would like it to be viable. I think if it comes to peace with the leaderships of the Sunni nations, it's already working very well. But as my friend Colonel Doug McGregor repeatedly warns, the mainstream Sunni Muslim street is appalled by the failure of the United States, especially, and of their own governments, to stop the endless bombardment, Israeli military operations and killing of civilians in Gaza over the past 2+ years. And there is a real fear from Pakistan to Morocco, much wider than the Sunni Muslim heartland of the Muslim world, that there could be violent revolutions from the army, the kind of things we saw repeatedly in the 1950s and 60s, overthrowing the pro-Western governments, because the pro-Western governments have lost all credibility by their failure to protect the Palestinians. And I think that's a very real danger, an enormous danger. And I think President Trump and his people, who I wish every success to, are blind to that danger. Colonel McGregor warns about that danger, and I think he's absolutely right. Oh, if I may go back to squeeze in one point, because otherwise people will think I'm ducking the question. Why was the Balfour Declaration given? It was sent to Rothschild, but Rothschild didn't even particularly want it. Assimilationist English Jews opposed Zionism, opposed the Balfour Declaration, for the very reason that came true, that they knew they would be accused of dual loyalties to Britain and this none yet existent dream of a Jewish state in Palestine. And they were making fortunes, and the upper English middle class were. Who was the only member of the War Cabinet in 1917 who opposed the Balfour Declaration? He was a Jewish member. Edwin Montagu, Secretary of State for India. And he had two reasons for doing so. First was the dual view thing. He personally was appalled by Zionism and was terrified by it. And secondly, here's an irony, he's a Jew, he's a practicing Jew. But he's also Secretary of State to run the Indian Empire. And the Indian Empire has 50 to 100 million Muslims in it. It has the largest Muslim population in the world, much larger than the entire Ottoman Empire, Turkish Empire did at the time. And they were going to be furious, he feared, over the Balfour Declaration, over granting a Jewish homeland in the heart of Sunni Islam. And sure enough, it caused big problems in India. There were other things like Mr. Gandhi with the Hindu nationalists who caused them much bigger problems. But that was there. But here's the irony. So why did they give it? They gave it because they were panic-stricken, ignorant people who ironically believed in a Jewish conspiracy that didn't exist. They were losing World War I. They'd lost 500,000 men dead in the British Army alone in the Battle of the Somme in 1916. They had lost another 300,000 English dead. It took them 50 years and mass immigration to make up the losses in men's lives that they suffered in those 2 years, because their generals were brave, but their generals were contemptible and lousy. And what did they see? They saw an America that was had just entered the war, but appeared not to be making any efforts to actually get troops on the ground to get slaughtered by wonderful British generals on their behalf. And they saw a Russia that had been taken over in the Bolshevik Revolution, which was tired of bleeding to death, not just for Britain, but mainly for France, because it was French manipulation, above all, that pulled Russia into World War I. Poincaré was the real evil son of a bitch, directly responsible. And a few very good historians, none of them French, none of them English, mainly Australian, I found, look at that and point that out, and it's crucial. But the chief expert on the Middle East and on the Ottoman Empire sends a memo to the cabinet, which sounds like a bad story for a British boy's own comic in the 1890s, which he probably based it on. And he actually says at the time, he died of pneumonia in 1919, so he can't be held accountable, unfortunately, afterwards. But he caused 100 years of war and suffering throughout the Middle East for Arabs, Muslims, Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, and Jews alike. For all of them, he caused catastrophe. And the memo says in 1917, you know, we don't have the Zionists on our side, but they are all powerful in Moscow and they are all powerful in Washington. And if we give the Balfour Declaration and promise them a national homeland, all of a sudden the Jewish influence, which has been welded, the Zionist influence, which has been welded on the side of Germany up to now, will automatically come to us. It means, you know, America will magically commit to the war. It means the Lenin's regime will magically support the war because the Jews control Lenin. Now, this is the kind of anti-Semitic fantasy shit that even Hitler and Goebbels would have been ashamed to come up with. It is so wrong, it is so ignorant, so simplistic. The Zionists were what they call in German and in Yiddish too, Luftmenschen. They were men of air. They lived in dreams. They didn't have a clue how governments worked or what governments were. They had zero influence in America. The main Jewish influence, Louis Brandeis, who was a close friend of President Wilson, was actually an anti-state Zionist. He favored a Jewish national home within the British Empire, or maybe within an American empire or under a League of Nations mandate. But he never favored any kind of independent Jewish state at all. And he opposed Ben-Gurion on it bitterly for 25 years.
I mean, he still wanted a state just within the purview of the British Empire, right?
No, he didn't even want a state. He didn't trust the state. He wanted a Jewish national home where some Jews could come in and would be a center for Jewish national culture. And
he didn't want like a Jewish government or anything like that?
No, not at all. And he hated the idea of a Jewish army.
So he just wanted to get the Jews to go to that region in order to have a homeland.
Yeah, a few of them, not even most of them. He didn't want a homeland in that sense. I mean, he and Ben-Gurion clashed ferociously. And Ben-Gurion, as you know, was not... there were maximum type Zionists. There was Jabotinsky and his successor Menachem Begin. And even Jabotinsky was used by the British during World War I and afterwards. But by 1920, even Jabotinsky was seen to be such an unrealistic, foaming at the mouth, raving lunatic that even the cynical British couldn't use him anymore. And he was exiled from Jerusalem in 1921 for advocating an armed Jewish defense force. And he was never, for the next 20 years till the day he died, ever allowed back in Palestine. He was regarded as too much of a risk. As too much of a risk.
Yeah, I mean, Ben-Gurion despised him too, and that's
exactly. But the reason the Balfour Declaration was given is it was given, issued by panic-stricken, ignorant men who really believed there was a Jewish super Zionist conspiracy that controlled everything that was happening in Moscow and Washington. It was a fantasy, but they were losing World War I to the Germans. And what won World War I for them in the end? Actually, the Americans did, because the American army finally turned up, and then Germany fell apart.
Yeah. Well, you know, one thing interesting that I was coming across when I had to do a little bit of this work for one of my recent books was just looking more deeply into the protocols of Zion and their origin, and finding out that the entire Blavatsky network that had deeply penetrated the halls of power in Russia, Yelena Glinka was one of the biggest priestesses and channelers, who was a very, very big protege of Blavatsky, Helena Blavatsky. Was working very hard with her access to the princess sorry, the queen, or not the queen, the Tsarina, not the Tsarina, the wife of Tsar Nicholas II.
No, she was the Tsarina. Yeah.
Yeah, she's Tsarina, right? That's the name. I wasn't sure if that was the official title. So anyway, she was like working really hard to bring in what's been proven to be a complete hoax document and circulate that to really flame the paranoia of the royal family, and especially Tsar Nicholas II, and around this idea that you have to reinstate the pogroms. The Jews killed your father. It's Jewish anarchists that are behind this big cabal that killed your father. That poisoned him, that killed your grandfather, that blew him up. And so they did this, and it was being promulgated and Henry Ford was picking up on this and printing the English versions in the United States, and Churchill was picking up on this and going gaga about this conspiracy. And it's interesting to see psychologically how these occult networks that are tied to high-level intelligence are creating these myths that even the higher echelons of elites are falling for in their fanatic belief that they have to do everything possible to bring in some savior, some strong man to cleanse the world of this pox. In this case, it became rampant fascism as the big solution in Germany, but also in the Americas, right? There was people underestimate today. If you go back in time and you examine the growth of the American fascist parties in the 1930s and 40s, and how they didn't go away after World War II. They just changed brandings. But you had the silver shirts and the Technocracy Inc. crowd that Joshua Haldeman, Elon Musk's grandfather, was heading the Canadian branch of Technocracy Inc. and was writing these rampant anti-Semitic treaties, treating the Protocols of Zion as if they were like gospel. Like these things were there, and there's many more that were emulating Oswald Mosley in North America and Canada. So it's really important to sort of see how people say, oh, misinformation today and in alternative media and conspiracy narratives is like a new novel thing, because obviously there's a lot of misinformation designed to derail people's minds who are trying to make sense of a broader reality outside of the standard model that we've been told to abide by. But no, there's obviously higher intentions that are often very bad ideas. And it's very difficult for people to learn how to like recalibrate their thinking and try to make sense of like, well, what is this? We see so many people fall apart on lizard shape-shifting aliens, Palladian grand masters orchestrate things, and is the Earth flat or cube or square or oval, or is it the back of a cosmic duck or whatever? So I mean, it's not a new thing. This goes back even then to just seeing how intelligence agencies are creating mythologies to deflect people from actually being able to grasp truth and then deal with solutions that normal human beings will organically work towards if they're thinking with a cogent mind. So I really appreciate just having you with your historical insights and your personal experience as well, which I think adds a lot to that. As somebody who's been on the ground, as I mentioned at the beginning, you've hobnobbed with some of these major power elites, and you've lived to tell the tale. You've got a lot of insight that you've gleaned. Huh?
So far, I've lived to tell the tale.
So far, so good. So far, so good. I'm impressed, and I appreciate you sharing your observations with us. So, Marty, any final closing words for people before we round out today's show?
Listen to what Matt said, and tune in again to this show. Please do.
All right.
And yeah.
Okay, and also I'll just say one last thing. Marty's books are going to be available. I'll put them in the comment section under this video in the next 5-10 minutes. So check those out. Pick up his books, Cycles of Change, and I forget the other one that you've written many books, but what's the other big one that you
Gathering Storm. Cycles
Gathering
of
Storm.
Change and Gathering Storm are the two key books about the crisis convulsing the United States. And I wrote them 10 years ago, and I published them 10 years ago, and they're more true today than they were then.
Good.
And if I may, Matt, one other pitch, and that is I have my own joint podcasts, two of them, one with you, of course, bless you, Beyond Geopolitics. Please tune in. if you got any sense, if not from me, at least from Matt, tune in and watch us. And Matt has also many superlative solo guests on that show. It's very important, highest quality. And I've also launched another new one with my British, Anglo-Swedish journalist, good friend to Matt too, Pele Neroth-Taylor. And it's called Capitals Uncovered. And we have 5 episodes so far. And the 5th episode is very practical advice for people who will watch the show. What to do when the deep state threatens you. And the answer is don't defy them. Respect them as much, take the warning as much as you can. You live longer. You live longer. And this is practical.
Marty, I don't know. I'm assuming that there's some more nuance to that. So I'll check out the video.
There's a lot of nuance to it, Matt. That's the point. Exactly. Okay. No, you're absolutely
send me
right.
a link to your new show. Yeah, send me a link to your new show. I'll include that as well. So everybody, thank you so much for tuning in this week, and see you next week on Breaking History.
Thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to hit the thumbs up on this video. And a special thank you to all of our advertising partners. Please remember to shift your dollars to support those businesses that support Badlands Media.